Good evening. Hello and welcome. I'm Donna Cox, and I'm absolutely delighted that Lynn Kenderdine from Devon Wildlife Trust is giving a talk for More Meadows this evening on the Avon Valley Project, a nature recovery network linking the Dartmoor to the sea. A question and answer session will follow. So please, would you start putting your questions into the chat bar as we're going along if anything arises, and we'll come to all of those after the talk. Lynn has worked in conservation for the last 25 years, and the last 10 have been working on the Avon Valley Project. In fact, she established it. And I was thinking the other day when it was that I actually met Lynn, and it was pre-More Meadows days, probably pre-Avon Valley Project, when I asked her to come and give me some advice about a bracken bank. And the bank was south-facing, it had a damp area at the bottom and also some trees, but there were also some common dog violets under the bracken. And Lynn advised that I might want to manage it for pearl-bordered fritillaries. And following her advice, I'm very pleased to say that we have a small colony now of not only small pearl-bordered fritillary butterflies, but pearl-bordered as well. A big part of Lynn's role is to give advice to landowners and farmers. And a big part of her role is about making connections between people, connecting people together, and of course, connecting land. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your talk, Lynn. So over to you, Lynn.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Lynn Kenderdine. I'm Land Management Advisory Officer with Devon Wildlife Trust, and I just want to say thank you to Donna for inviting me to talk to you all this evening, and thank you to you for giving up some of your precious time to tune in. So forgive me if this is a bit disjointed. I'm just going to share my slideshow and get to full screen mode, which has been a challenge, I must tell you. So there we go. So incredibly, as Donna said, I've been working on the Avon Valley Project for the past 10 years. I've been really fortunate to be able to do so. And I've got to say that the last few years have been the best years of my conservation career. The Avon Valley Project is a co-funded project between Devon Wildlife Trust and South Devon Nature Trust. And I just want to, I've not got many slides, but I just want to take a moment to say a little bit about this photograph, because it's quite an iconic picture for our project. It's overlooking the estuary on higher land at Orton Gifford, and it was the first of our meadow restoration projects. A chap called Dave Halsell, who at that time had 8 acres of semi-improved grassland, had a few species in it, let's say about 15 species. We did a survey before we started. And in those early days, Dave said, yeah, I'd love to have a go and try and create a wildflower meadow. And South Devon Nature Trust, our co-funder, funded 50 quid's worth of seed. Dave put some money in, and we green hayed it with some green hay from Longmarsh. And a few years later, and regular management, later cutting for hay, sheep grazing, aftermath sheep grazing, yes, and it became the first site where we had we took our meadow makers to, and it's an absolute joy, thriving with wildflowers and humming with insects in the summer. So that's a really positive place to start. Much less interesting photo now, but for those of you who don't know, I want to say a little bit about the Avon. It's one of several rivers that rise in South Dartmoor, up on the moor at Orne Head. The catchment then stretches 17,000 hectares, or about 42, 45 acres in old money. It's a relatively short river, 25 miles long. So I was trying to think of landmarks today in a linear kind of way. So if you think of travelling from Exeter Cathedral to Buckfast Abbey, that's about the length of the Avon. And it has this really, for me, quite unique set of subcatchments, tributaries or valley systems. So I tend to think of the main river as the trunk of a tree, and then it has these 17 branches that all feed into the main channel. And each of those valley systems has its own set of characteristics. So rising at Orne Head, and here I am, fortunate enough to make a pilgrimage right to the top. This is where it starts, in the soup, and then it stretches, it flows a few miles across open moorland to where it's impounded by the Avon Dam. I'm sure many of you who live on Dartmoor are more familiar with this terrain than I am. But the Avon Dam, we connect to the Avon every time we turn our taps on in the South Hams, as it supplies our water. And from there, it flows downstream. And on its way, if you close your eyes and imagine it passing through a multitude of wonderful habitats: ancient woodland, broad-leaved woodland, wet woodland, floodplain meadows, lowland grasslands, marshland, right down to the lower reaches, to the estuary where it becomes tidal at Orton Gifford, and then the mudflats, and then the beaches at Bantham, the sand dune system, and it even has its own island down at Burr Island. So it's got such a varied habitat across its length. And of course, it's also home to, traditionally home to farming, lowland farming, and as all the land in the South Hams is very workable, good soils for agriculture, for farming, supporting mixed farming right to the edge of the coast, as we can see here. But knitted together, I just want to try and get back to the slide that I had before. That might be difficult, but knitted together by this intimate landscaping in sections of bushy hedgerows and small remnant field systems. So all those habitats support some rare species. On the left, Heath lobelia. This is at Andrews Wood Nature Reserve. There are 3 nature reserves in the Avon catchment: Ladies Wood at South Brent, Andrews Wood down at Loddiswell, and South Efford Marsh. Heath lobelia, Andrews Wood, Triple SI, it supports the last remaining substantial Heath lobelia colony in the UK. I think there's some in Cornwall, and there's some down in Kent. But aside, these are the only 2 or 3 places in the UK where it's hanging on, and Andrews Wood has the largest colony. Dormice. South Devon is still a stronghold. You go out of Devon and certainly go up country, and dormice are incredibly rare. Our networks of hedgerows and coppice woodlands still provide wonderful habitat for dormice. But sadly, like a lot of our species, or all of our species, they are creatures in decline. Grey long-eared bat, the rarest bat in the UK, has maternity roosts in the Avon Valley. And alongside, I haven't got a photo of them, but alongside the grey long-eared bat, they're greater horseshoe bats. You could also add to this list Atlantic salmon, otter, barn owl, great green bush cricket, a substantial list. So that might begs the question, well, why, if everything's so good, wonderful habitat, and a lot of rare species, which also tell you something that about the habitat quality, that there's something good going on that supports all those species. Why is it necessary to have a project? I'm sure that's one of the questions that Donna will be asking me, so I won't go into detail on that now, but just to say a bit about our project. We're celebrating 10 years this autumn. We offer free of charge habitat management advice. A lot of our work is focused on building networks, building relationships. We visited a total of 109, and we have engaged with more or less 400 individuals, you can say. And our land coverage is 3,103 hectares. This is what our catchment looks like. So I don't know whether you're going to get very much from seeing that on your screens, but this is our working Bible, if you like. This is a great working tool to be able to show landowners where their land is. So the red areas, the hatched red areas, are those land holdings, the boundaries of the land holdings where we've visited and connected with people. And we are welcoming all landowners. So whether you've just got an acre or 100 acres, whether you're a farmer or a smallholder, or someone just owns a bit of land, our approach is the same. You've got a contribution to make for wildlife, and we want to engage with you. So the red areas are where we visited and engaged with people. If you can see the yellow areas, those are where we've created or restored wildflower meadows. We started with that one site a few years ago, 8-acre site, and now we're working across almost 100 acres on 30 separate sites. And those yellow lights are a joy to see lighting up. And the green areas are those designated grassland sites, so designated meadows, but not all of those are meadows. Is that a bit of a contradiction? They can be woodland sites with meadow areas in amongst them. And that as a working tool helps us build up an evolving picture of habitat connectivity. This might help explain things a bit more, and I guess forms the basis of any nature recovery network, if that's what you want to call this habitat connectivity project. That was the main thrust of our work, to provide a more connected landscape for wildlife to move through. So this is again a working tool for us. So this is a kind of a snapshot of sites that we're working with. You've got the main river coming down through. If you look at the Brimridge site, and then more or less think of that, the river coming down the centre of the of the picture, and then it bears off to the left. I think, yes, it does. Yeah, I'm just checking myself. Yes, I'm orientating myself. I'm in the driving seat. Everything is fine. So yes, so the river, yeah. So I can see where it says Ben Meadows. That's the area to the east of Orton Gifford Bridge. You've got South Efford Marsh, which is the red hatched area. To the east, to the west of the road bridge, Green Park Farm, which was the slide at the beginning of the picture, which is the beginning of the presentation, sorry, that overlooks South Efford Marsh down to the river. So the red areas are where we've engaged with landowners, engaging with landowners. The yellow areas are where we have and worked with landowners to enhance their meadows. We've been monitoring dormice with my colleague of 6 years, Craig Dunton, who led on the dormouse monitoring element of the project. That's up through Andrews Wood, between Andrews Wood and MGM nurseries, where we know we've got dormouse populations at both sites, and wanted to investigate and explore whether they were in the hedgerows on the improved farmland in between. We've planted to help people plant new hedgerows to help them draw down grants from the Woodland Trust. And so at the site called Long Park and Chantry, so that's 675 metres of hedgerow, new hedgerow, which has gone in to connect up for otherwise fragmented woodlands to provide that connectivity. So it's an evolving picture. It's not static, and habitat change and transformation is something that certainly keeps me well fired up, and there's nothing more gives me more pleasure when we're working with interested and committed landowners who decide to try something new and take positive action on their land. So this is a site in the Hazelwood Valley where the landowner decided to stop cutting for hay and stop grazing. This photo was taken in 2018, and this is the same site a couple of years, just last week actually. So about 2 years later, and he reports hearing more owls. Of course, and the owls are hunting, using his grounds as hunting grounds for small mammals that will be using all that wonderful long grass habitat for shelter and to run through. And of course, it wouldn't be good to be doing a presentation for more meadows and not talk about meadows. And as I mentioned, this is one of our 30 sites where we are working with keen landowners. Not many species in this semi-improved pasture. We seeded it for a good 2 or 3 years. The first year after we broadcast a yellow rattle rich mix, we got a sea of buttercups. But then tends to be 3 years on that we see those ecological shifts, and after three years, the eyebright came in, more red clover, the rattle doing its job, knapweed. We even had 1 or 2 orchids. So this meadow really took off and established itself. And it's not just about the flowers, of course, but the whole invertebrate, the the whole ecosystem and the range of species that they support. So we're creating new stepping stones for wildlife. And we couldn't do any of this without people power. We're fortunate enough to be able to tap into Devon Wildlife Trust volunteer group in a normal year, not last year obviously, but pre-COVID times. We have use of a very active South Devon and Dartmoor volunteer group with the trust for about 4 days a year. And here they are clearing very, very overmature gorse and scrub from species-rich grassland that had just got neglected. And so that created more space. They're instrumental in our meadow making process, where some sites aren't appropriate to be grazed, people can't get their meadows cut and baled and taken away. They help with the raking off process. And here they are on a very inclement day in December a couple of years ago, planting that new hedge at Long Park. The farmer came along, not on the same day, those are 2 different days. So I'm looking in the top right-hand corner and the bottom left-hand corner. So after we planted the hedge, we returned 13, 14 months later to do some hedge maintenance work just to clear weeds from the saplings. And the farmer came along and thanked the volunteers and gave them a bit of a chat about his philosophy and what he'd done on his land, which all helps to set the context. So this is a list of our achievements in terms of what we've achieved on very little resource, I must say. So I mentioned that this is co-funded by Devon Wildlife Trust and South Devon Nature Trust, but basically that has DWT fund me. I'm a part-time advisor. I work 3 days a week, and South Devon Nature Trust for the past 9 years have funded an advisor 2 days a week. So it's not as if we've been working on this full time. And we've been working outside of agri-environment funding. So we've worked with a lot of goodwill and a lot of people power, and drawn down funding where we can. So this is what we've achieved collectively: 40 hectares, or nearly in excess of 90 acres of new wildflower meadows. I call them wildflower meadows in transition because some of them aren't quite there yet. 2 hectares of new woodland and shelter belt planting. That's on 2 sites. 675 metres of new hedgerow. We've enabled reintroduction and facilitation of grazing on 12 separate sites, working with conservation graziers, Cows in Clover, which is a really good relationship that works well. We got some funding from the Devon Greater Horseshoe Bat project for temporary electric fencing and a water bowser, and that allows us to get into some areas that had previously become undergrazed, and so we've been able to restore meadows that way. Scrub clearance I mentioned, 4 hectares. Over 200 metres of fencing installed. South Devon Nature Trust have put money into capital works where they can, and so that enabled 2 farmers to manage their stock and their meadows much more effectively. We've lent a hand with minor coppicing works on 4 county wildlife site woodlands in the area, and we're fortunate enough to be working with one very generous landowner in creating a nature reserve of the future I've described it there. It's on its way to being rewilded. So that's a little overview of the project. These are my contact details, which you can take down now, or I'm sure it'll be shared on YouTube, so you'll be able to contact me, Lynn Kenderdine at Devon Wildlife Trust, lkenderdine@devonwildlifetrust.org, 07392 865 905, and I always forget that mobile number. Okay, Donna, that's me, that's my slides.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lynn. That's very interesting. I've got some questions for you. I mean, when you started the project, I can see that Avon Valley itself is such a fantastic range of habitats. That was the decision by Devon Wildlife Trust to focus on the Avon Valley. How did you start? Can you tell us a bit about the mapping process? Are you picking out the county wildlife sites, or again, species, where the species are, and then deciding who to target based on that?
Okay, so when we started, so I'll go back to 2008, 2009. Devon Wildlife Trust and other wildlife trusts had started working at what they call the landscape scale, or at the catchment scale, which in the conservation world we're now much more familiar with. But at the time, it was quite a revolutionary approach to actually start to look at how areas of land related to each other, and they sit within a landscape or they sit within a catchment. So we had started to focus that kind of work on the culm grasslands in North Devon, which had always cut the conservation of the culm, or rose pasture, or springline mires as they're known in the Blackdown Hills, had always been a priority in terms of conservation for DWT. And so at the time, the Wildlife Trust, Devon Wildlife Trust, were looking at other areas that they may develop a landscape scale approach in. And so we looked at South Devon and we looked at the Avon, and the Wildlife Trust as a movement had gone through a process termed rebuilding biodiversity, which was looking at ecological function and the kind of things, what area of woodland or do you need for it to be viable for wildlife conservation. And so with the Avon Valley being quite wooded already, that was an area that came out of that rebuilding biodiversity methodology. And then on a much more kind of practical basic level, we had a long history of working in the South Hams. There'd been the Greater Horseshoe Bat project that Natural England, when it was known as English Nature, had been leading on. DWT had worked in partnership with South Devon AONB on a Heritage Lottery funded project called Life into Landscape. And before then, we'd had county wildlife site surveys. So it was an area where we'd already been advising landowners. We'd already been working. We already knew about the area in terms of its designated sites, and of course, we got our 3 nature reserves. So we had a bit of a foot in the door. And so the Avon seemed a natural place to go.
Yeah. Okay. And so how did you decide who you were going to target? So you already had some contacts there, but what was the sort of sell for it, I suppose? What are the benefits of participating? Advice,
Yeah,
community?
yeah. So when we first started, we wanted to, it seemed a good place to start on those county wildlife site grasslands. So the sites that we knew about, those green areas that were hatched on the map I showed earlier. So we were recontacting landowners of those sites, and we were basically checking if it was still a meadow, because no one had visited since 1996. Is your meadow still here? So there was an element of ground truthing. And so it was a little bit, at that point, we weren't necessarily working in any particular area or region of the valley. And so it was about talking to people. I went round the conservation organisations asking for contacts. So it was it was kind of vague, because we were approaching people, not really saying, they weren't coming to us for advice. We were going to people and saying, you know, is your meadow still here? Or we're offering free of charge advice, you know, what's happening with the rest of your land? You know, are there, you know, how could you enhance your land for wildlife? You know, we talked about our general aims and what they were. And it really started to grow when South Devon Nature Trust came on board, and a chap called Ed Parferris came into post, and we split the catchment. So Ed took a certain area and I took a certain area, and it really started to build from there. And then it's a bit like Moores Meadows, Donna, you know, it's like, you know, you speak to one person, they tell their neighbours, who tell their neighbours, and someone else down the line gets in touch with you. So that's how it built, really.
Well, that's wonderful, though, isn't it? That actually so many landowners and in Moore Meadows are actually want to do something for wildlife and are looking for advice. So they were doing it out of goodwill, really, because they wanted to do something for nature.
Yes, and I think we're very open. We want to connect with anyone who owns or manages land. So I think that was a bit of a different model, because we just weren't working with the farming community on countryside stewardship schemes. We you know, and actually the majority of people we've attracted are smallholders.
Okay.
But we didn't have anything to sell. You know, we didn't necessarily have a capital pot. You know, we didn't have a grant scheme. You know, at first it was a bit vague and a bit woolly. But once we started on our meadow creation work and the practical help with woodland management that through South Devon Nature Trust, Ed and Craig were able to give, coupled with the DWT volunteers, because what would happen is, as we sort of visited people, they would say, well, you know, maybe a farmer would say, well, I have got some interesting meadows, but, you know, they've not been grazed since the foot and mouth crisis. And so now they've got 14-foot gorse, and, you know, it's not a priority. It wasn't a priority for them, but it was a priority for us and for nature conservation. So we were able to have a work party, clear the scrub, let more light on, let the meadows thrive again, and bring them back into his kind of grazing management.
Yeah. And any people that you approached, what were their reasons for not participating?
So I think, in terms of participating, I guess we do quite a lot of networking. So we're interested in what people have got on their land, because obviously that will tell us about the habitat quality. So I don't think anyone's refused a visit from us, I think it's fair to say that perhaps more, commercial farmers in the valley, if they're already in their stewardship agreements, then they can't necessarily see how we could help them. And so I think that's perhaps a barrier from maybe the farming community coming towards us more.
Yes.
But yeah.
Going forward, do you think that there's going to be more opportunity, particularly with the Elm scheme coming in? Although, of course, at the moment, we don't know what that's going to be or how much money there's going to be. We know what it's going to be, but we don't know how much money there's going to be.
I think the agri-environment schemes, they're so the spirit of the schemes and the intention of the schemes is really fantastic. And then it comes down to targeting, because there's so much money in the pot, where that money is going to be spent and how it will be distributed. But I think there are opportunities for wildlife everywhere. So you can think of the most intensive dairy farm or arable farm, and there are opportunities, around the field edges, for field margins, for buffer strips, for hedges, for hedgerow trees. It needn't be everybody, creating wildflower meadows or planting woodlands or rewilding or, creating I think there are so many opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think that the way these schemes will be managed they'll be more assessed on environmental outcomes. Because I think that's what interests me about not getting, as an advisor, I've worked on countryside stewardship, and it's, there's a lot of work that goes into getting people into stewardship, helping them make their application. What interests me is getting the most for biodiversity out of those agreements and helping those agreements work for people.
Yeah. So if you have somebody who, is interested in joining in, and you go and visit their land and you're looking at the habitat, how do you set about, we talk a lot about connecting up landscapes and wildlife corridors, but actually what does that mean on the ground? How would you decide how you're going to connect a landscape and where the connection should be? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I think that's really interesting. So when we started, there's nothing like going out on a site, on an area of land, and assessing it so that you know what's there. So we visit a lot of people where, the habitat's already good for wildlife, and they're already doing lots of the right things. And so we encourage people to maybe keep doing what they're doing, or, can they do things a bit, is there scope for a new orchard, or managing their hedgerows in a different way, or, planting shelter belts, or whatever it is. And then we're obviously looking over the hedge at what's happening, how is their land connecting to their neighbour's land? And so I think a nature recovery project, we didn't do it in a very targeted way. So when we started out, but you could think of, identifying corridors so that you're looking at where your nature reserves are, where are the sites that you've got security over. So how, thinking of Andrews Wood or Ladies Wood, what's the condition of the hedgerows or the land around it? So how can the widest range of species commute from place to place? What's missing? And so in a very targeted way, you could then say, okay, well, there's no, there aren't any hedgerow trees, or 100 metres of hedgerow was taken out. And if you plant a new hedgerow, like we did at Long Park or Chantry, that will make a huge difference for wildlife, and you would focus on that area. Or you could take the most degraded, flailed line of hedges that aren't functioning well for wildlife, and you could make that your focus. But I think, you know, what you can only do your bit on your bit of land, but being aware of how where your bit of land fits in to that bigger jigsaw.
Yes.
And that when you're creating, so all those More Meadows members that are creating or restoring or enhancing or managing their meadows, what they're really creating is new stepping stones, new pollinator sites, new nesting sites, new back corridors. They're improving that habitat connectivity.
So if you were starting again, would you do things differently? Like just talking about that, about connecting up sites, would you try and be even more targeted about joining those stepping stone sites up, if it was possible?
In today's climate, bearing in mind that we are, you know, there's a huge surge in people's awareness and desire to take action. So if I was starting now, in today's, as we are today, I would look for perhaps wildlife champions within parishes or within villages, who and be perhaps a little bit more hands off, and to enable communities to equip themselves to achieve what we're doing on the Avon Valley, because it's happening already in many places, neighbour to neighbour, village to village, parish to parish. Yeah, you're involved in, is it the Be Wild in Buckfastleigh, which is really inspiring, and how people can, you know, what people can do in their gardens or with their road verges, looking at all our available green spaces and how they link. But I think looking at, if people have to start where they are, look at where the nature reserves are, and then look at other designated sites, counting which sites are already known to be good for wildlife. So whether it's an ancient woodland, river corridor, nature reserve, park, and then think about the linkages and try to see things from a bat's eye view or a bird's eye view. What are those creatures looking for?
Well, could you tell us a bit about the importance of the corridors and what wildlife is actually using the corridors? I know about, you know, bats are using hedgerows and trees. Could you talk about that, about dormice, and even hedgehogs obviously are using hedgerows?
Yeah, so I'm sure people might be familiar with this, but to keep it in its simplest form. So what we've got is, I want to reach for two objects. So I'm just going to reach for my water and the water jug. So basically, you know, habitats have become fragmented. They're no longer joined. There's nothing to connect this woodland and this woodland. And if, you know, hedges have been taken out, roads have been put in, and if you take something out of the landscape, then, you know, you're isolating this habitat even more. So the connecting edges are vital. So to have, you know, now I'm going to ask you to all imagine an imaginary bridge between jug and glass. And that's a corridor. That's a connecting corridor. And that's what species need to move around. So bats echolocate, don't they, a lot along woodland edges, along the bank sides of rivers. Butterflies will use, you know, individual patches of gorse and scrub and flowers. You know, there's nothing. I've been I was surveying road verges at Wembury a couple of years ago, and there was dandelions in flower, and that was it. And I was watching a bee hover from dandelion to dandelion, and then there was no, and then there's nothing. What they're looking for is pollinating sites, food sites, feeding larders, shelter. So the more wildlife, the more habitat we can produce, the better. Whether that's leaving a rough grass margin in our gardens, cutting our gardens later, creating wildflower meadows or patch habitats, all that is going to help creatures move around.
Yeah, I can see we're getting quite a few questions coming in. I've got quite a few I still want to ask you, but we can't fit them in. We've got to I'll have a look at some of these. Some good questions have come through. Christopher Hughes says that he had difficulty establishing yellow rattle in his garden on semi-improved land. Do you test for phosphate levels before seeding?
We haven't actually. We've just given it a go. That's the honest answer. Some people have soil tested, and others haven't. So it really depends. I don't know whether it's so much the phosphate levels. I think with yellow rattle, it could be, there's such a lot of things to consider, isn't there? Viability of seed. Is it buried deep enough? Has it been cold enough?
Yeah.
All those things.
Yeah.
I've tried with yellow rattle in my garden, and I think I had one plant a couple of years ago under a shady bit of the hedge. So yeah.
Yeah, there's so many variables. It's true.
Yes.
And I have to say, I didn't do soil tests at the beginning when I started with yellow rattle. I just gave it a go. But I mean, I knew the history of my site, and I knew it hadn't been fertilized for like the last 25 years. So
yeah,
it was worth giving it a go.
Yeah, I think what we've said to people is, actually, if you want to give it a go, don't spend a lot of money on seed, don't spray off, start where you are. And so to develop, because transitioning a habitat is a process. And so what we try and encourage is for people to engage with that process and enjoy the changes and observe what happens and to work with things. I know that can be very, patience is can be frustrating, because that change, you don't get it instantly. But the more we do this work and the more I've observed through experience, those shifts come, and when they come, they're much more sustainable. So
yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, the same recommendation with meadow creation, with more meadows, is, do nothing to begin with, but let your grass grow up and see what's in it actually before jumping in, harrowing and going through all that work of reseeding before actually finding out what you've got. And luckily in Dartmoor, there have been several meadows that have, just through changes in management, so just going through the regime of, say, a hay cut every year and then grazing in the autumn, has restored meadows in a very quick space of time without actually having to add any seed at all. So
I agree, Donna,
about being patient.
Yeah, and sometimes changing that, early bite, getting the sheep on in March, April, changing that element of things really helps meadows to flourish. Yes. Landowners have been amazed, actually, to see what they've got under their feet by just, tweaking their management a little bit.
Yeah, and the biggest change in management, of course, is not grazing in spring and summer. Although in some sites you would graze in spring, so it is a nuanced thing in some cases. But it's well, I don't graze at all in the spring and summer, and then you just get a different meadow of when
Yes.
to graze. Steve would like to know, I think you've answered this, but we'll just quickly have a look. Steve would like to know what species move through a connected landscape most readily.
Oh, yes, good question. What species would move through most readily? Well, the most mobile species, I guess, birds and bats and mammals. The more sedentary would be, you know, things like reptiles, amphibians, some insects. I mean, some have got really, some butterflies and moths have really got very specific egg-laying requirements, haven't they? So they're looking for specific niche habitats. So yeah, I think it's birds, mammals and bats that would move more readily.
Yeah, agree. Heather Weaver, Alan, says that you mentioned that cows are useful for grazing. Would a small unshod herd of ponies do equally as well?
Yes. So each animal has different grazing and browsing qualities. So cattle and ponies are really very useful because of their body weight. So their trampling action, they tend to be a bit more less fussy in terms of what they eat. Their dentition means that they browse and they nibble, and the way that they take fodder means that you get a different structural variety. So yeah, it's not any grazing animal will give you a different result. If you want something taken down really short, sheep do a brilliant job, especially if you're you know you're wanting to graze over winter to reduce your grass competition. Sheep will nibble down really well. But if you want that structural diversity, or in restorative grazing, maybe on sites that haven't been grazed for a while, using ponies or using cattle will be excellent.
Is there an advantage of using, I don't know, just cattle because of their dung and their and dung beetles? That's assuming they haven't been wormed with, we know, like
Ivermectin, without ivermectins.
without
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think cattle dung is the best in terms of, you know, dung beetles prefer it, and will, you know, lay their eggs in it and roll it and take it down into the ground and recycle it and do whatever they do with it. I think cattle are unwormed cattle are certainly the best. But again, having, you know, the value, I think, of grazing animals is in their, you know, the way they browse, their dung, their trampling effect, and the way, I think maybe the way that we use, I think there is a need for more conservation graziers to be using their animals to move through landscapes or move through an area of land, even if it's just once every 3 years, to create that kind of the diversity of habitat and that structural variety that we're seeking to create those niche habitats.
Yeah, I think that's right. Joe Treweek says that you've engaged with so many landowners. What distinguishes the ones who decide to give it a go? What swings it for them, and what do people cite as reasons not to try? I mean, we did touch on that earlier, but yeah, what does distinguish the ones who decide to give it a go?
What motivates people to manage their land for biodiversity? So I think there's, aside from perhaps, you know, we work with all kinds of people. So, you know, there are hundreds of farmers out there who are doing great things in terms of creating and managing wildlife habitat. I think there's an element of the tidy mind that actually, once you start talking about letting things go and letting things grow up, just thinking about my hair at the moment, you know, you won't get on your mower every other week and cut the grass. You'll let it grow every year, and you'll let it become coarse, and you might let it scrub up, and it will look unruly and untidy. And I think there is an element of that within all our society. People like neat and tidy, and often wildlife doesn't like neat and tidy. It likes unruly. It likes the tangle of nature. And I think we have to refine that balance between the tangle and the managed areas, and being a bit more relaxed, but consciously thinking, okay, if I let the ivy's not going to destroy the tree, and because I might not like the look of it, I need to understand actually what role it's playing. That it's it provides that wonderful late source of pollen in bees that are out in October, and that it's providing roosting sites for bats and birds, and that I don't need to get rid of it. I'm just using ivy as an example.
Yeah.
So that's one barrier. I've already mentioned, I think, the fact that, when people are earning a living from the land, there are difficult choices to be made. So, money might be a barrier.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. Robin Aronson asks if you can say a bit more about species which have flourished as a result of your work. Do you do baseline surveys?
We do, yes. So I think that's really important. So we do a condition assessment when we're visiting land, because you've got to know what's there and what you've got. And that really helps guide people, I think. Often, a simple one is often people want to dig ponds in already species-rich wetlands. It's the most obvious place to dig a pond, but if you've got, a range of wetland herbs, they're more valuable, and you can put your pond maybe in a less obvious place on your holding. So species that are flourishing, certainly in the meadows. So we botanically do botanical monitoring for a period of years whilst we're seeding and whilst we're altering that habitat. And what we witness is a real abundance in insect life on that particular habitat. It's all relative, isn't it? So when I'm saying abundance, that we're seeing, lots more shield bugs, beetles, butterflies, cinnabar moths, and we're hearing a lot more birds, and we're seeing brown hares, and when we're out and about in the area, there's just more
life.
When I say in the area, in the vicinity of the land that we're working on, and certainly in those new areas of tree planting, we found harvest mouse nests, lizards, that kind of thing. So things that weren't there before, we're certainly seeing, which just goes to show, when I first got involved in conservation, a chap called Fraser Rush said to me, if you look after the habitat, the species will look after themselves. And quite clearly, we need to look after the habitat more than we do now.
Yeah. And John Walters wonders if there's a possibility the project will be extended, and perhaps extended in, he hasn't said that, but extended in its scope, I suppose. And might there be funding for 2 full-time advisors? But I guess that's all down to whether Devon tries to raise some funds for, because in the end, a lot of landowners do need advice. They need someone like you to go out and have a look at their land and talk to them about the habitat, and then make decisions about where to extend it or where to create it.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, one of the questions you sent me, Donna, was the things like, you know, what have you learned? And something that was brought home to me through the COVID, through last year, really, was how important face-to-face interaction is, and that, you know, we can all learn so much online and do so much online, like tonight, which is great in the absence of us being able to meet in person, and not virtually. But I learn so much from people that I see. And it's a really wonderful, you know, exchange of experience. I think, you know, funding is always an issue for projects. And I think we've been really lucky in, you know, both DWT and South Devon Nature Trust have kept going with the project. We have got South Devon Nature Trust started to reduce their funding now. So, unfortunately, Craig left the project in November, so we're down to one advisor, me, at the moment. But, you know, in the future, I think as this work expands, and as indeed, you know, you called it a nature recovery project, that's going to be the way of the future for conservation, I think. And there'll be, you know, more people needed to engage with the landowning community, to offer a bit of guidance and support, and that enabling of communities, and providing those forums like More Meadows where people can, you know, help themselves. But I think one of the valuable things that Devon Wildlife Trust provides with all our advisory projects is that bigger picture overview. So, you know, and people it really seems to mean something when I meet people that they, you know, they look on the map, they can see where their land is, you know, and they think, oh, wow, you know, I am part of this. My land does, you can show them how their land joins up and how it relates to others, and how, you know, that some of the species that they see or that they're not seeing, why that might be and how they can make a difference. So I would like to think that we would, in the future, we would have more resource. I certainly know that it's, you know, Devon Wildlife Trust are committed to the Avon Valley project and this model of working. So, yeah, I'd say to anyone out there, please support us if you can.
Mm. And if you do support them, say that's exactly what you'd like it for. Is if
Yes.
Yes, if anyone did want to donate to Devon Wildlife, to say it's for the building of these these networks. So I think
that's what South Devon Nature Trust did. That's what, you know, they really wanted to support this project. And when it started, if I can just give a little quote, it was set up to explore ways of engaging local landowners, local communities and organisations in conservation of existing habitats and species, restoration of degraded habitats, creation of new opportunities for wildlife to thrive and spread. And I think, you know, thanks to South Devon Nature Trust and of course to DWT that fund me as well, but there's still work to be done.
There is much work to be done, and thank you, Lynn. I think that's all we've got time for this evening. We're 5 minutes over. There's a couple of questions still outstanding, but perhaps you can answer those for me. And what we'll do is I'll send links out, some links out tomorrow or over the weekend to people with the area of the catchment and your details again.
Wonderful, and I'd be really happy to answer those questions, Donna. And thank you very much, and thanks for everybody for tuning in and for your questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to Steve for feeding through questions from YouTube. Okay, good night.
Thanks, Steve. Good night.
Good night.